When you think of ancient megastructures, your mind probably drifts toward Egypt's pyramids, Stonehenge's towering stones, or perhaps the mysterious Moai of Easter Island. Yet tucked away in the rolling hills and river valleys of Georgia, yes, the American state nestled between the Appalachian Mountains and the Atlantic coast, lies a collection of archaeological mysteries so profound, so utterly inexplicable, that they've left scientists scratching their heads for generations. We're talking about earthen mounds that rival the Great Pyramid in volume, stone walls that shouldn't exist according to conventional timelines, and artifacts that suggest contact with civilizations thousands of miles away, centuries before Columbus ever set sail. These aren't just modest village sites or simple burial grounds. These are engineered landscapes that required thousands of workers, sophisticated astronomical knowledge, and organizational systems that challenge everything we thought we knew about pre-Columbian America. What you're about to discover will shake your understanding of North American history to its core. For decades, mainstream archaeology has painted a picture of the pre-contact Southeast as home to relatively simple societies, hunter-gatherers who eventually learned to farm corn and build modest villages. But the evidence lying beneath Georgia's red clay tells a radically different story. It speaks of complex chiefdoms with trade networks spanning from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, of astronomical observatories aligned with celestial precision, of metallurgical knowledge that produced copper artifacts using techniques that wouldn't be discovered in Europe for another 1,000 years. And then there are the mysteries that go beyond conventional archaeology into the realm of the truly unexplained, accounts of giant skeletons systematically excavated and then mysteriously disappeared, stone inscriptions in scripts that match no known Native American language, and legends among indigenous peoples of white-skinned visitors who arrived by sea long before any European expedition. Over the next hour, we're going to journey through 6 of Georgia's most baffling archaeological sites. You'll walk the same grounds where ancient engineers once labored to move millions of cubic feet of earth without metal tools or draft animals. You'll examine evidence that's been documented, measured, and carbon dated, and yet remains profoundly unexplained. We'll explore competing theories, from mainstream archaeological explanations to more controversial hypotheses involving pre-Columbian transoceanic contact. And we'll confront the unsettling reality that much of the evidence that could answer these questions has been lost, destroyed, or deliberately hidden away in the basements of museums that have no interest in rewriting textbooks. So settle in, because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about ancient America. The story begins not with what we've found, but with what we've forgotten. Picture yourself standing in Bartow County, Georgia, on a September morning in 1838. The air is thick with humidity, and morning fog still clings to the Etowah River as it winds through the valley below. Before you rises a massive earthen pyramid, its flat top looming more than 60 feet above the surrounding floodplain, its base covering nearly 3 acres of ground. This is Etowah Mounds, and what makes it so extraordinary isn't just its size, though at roughly 5 million cubic feet of carefully placed earth, it ranks among the largest prehistoric structures north of Mexico, but rather what it tells us about a civilization that supposedly never existed. According to conventional timelines, this massive ceremonial center was constructed by the Mississippian culture between 1000 and 1550 CE, serving as a political and religious capital for a chiefdom that controlled much of northern Georgia. But here's where the story gets interesting, and where mainstream archaeology begins to show its cracks. The engineering sophistication required to build Etowah Mounds suggests knowledge and organizational capacity that seems wildly out of step with what we're told about these simple, indigenous societies. Let's start with the basics, because even the basics are mind-blowing. The site consists of 6 earthen mounds, but the real showstopper is Mound A, the massive flat-topped pyramid that dominates the landscape. To construct this single mound, ancient engineers moved approximately 5 million cubic feet of earth, carrying it basket by basket from nearby borrow pits. Do the math with me here. If each basket held about 1 cubic foot of earth, a generous estimate, and each worker could make, say, 10 trips per day, you're looking at over 100,000 person days of labor just for the primary structure. And that's not accounting for the sophisticated construction techniques involved. These weren't just random piles of dirt. Archaeological excavations have revealed that the mounds were built in stages, with distinct layers of different colored clays, sands, and soils carefully chosen and placed. The external slopes were reinforced with clay mantles to prevent erosion. Drainage systems were engineered into the structures. This is sophisticated geotechnical engineering, the kind that requires understanding of soil mechanics, hydrology, and structural stability. Now, here's where things start to get really strange. When archaeologists excavated Mound C in the 1950s, a smaller structure used as an elite burial site, they discovered what can only be described as a treasure trove that shouldn't exist according to conventional models. The burial chamber contained artifacts that speak to trade networks spanning thousands of miles: copper from the Great Lakes region, shells from the Gulf Coast, mica from the Appalachians, and exotic stones from sources as far away as the Rocky Mountains. But it wasn't just the geographic spread that puzzled researchers. The craftsmanship of these objects was extraordinary. Copper headdress ornaments had been worked using techniques, including annealing and repoussé, that supposedly weren't practiced by indigenous peoples of the Southeast. Stone effigy figures displayed anatomical precision and artistic sophistication that rivals anything from Mesoamerica. And then there were the stone statues, life-size human figures carved from marble and other stones, their faces bearing features that some researchers insist don't match any known indigenous population. The famous Etowah marble statues have been a source of controversy since their discovery. 2 seated male figures and 1 seated female figure, each carved from Georgia marble with remarkable skill, depict individuals with what appear to be non-indigenous features: prominent noses, deep-set eyes, and in one case, what looks suspiciously like a beard. Now, mainstream archaeologists will tell you that Native Americans are perfectly capable of growing facial hair, and that you're seeing what you want to see in these weathered stone faces. But spend some time with these statues, really examine them, and you might find yourself wondering whether the official explanations are as complete as we're led to believe. The seated male figure, sometimes called the priest, wears elaborate ceremonial dress and appears to be holding objects in his hands, possibly representing power symbols or religious implements. The attention to anatomical detail, the sophisticated understanding of proportion and balance, the technical skill required to carve such figures from solid marble, all of this points to a level of artistic and technical achievement that seems inconsistent with our picture of Mississippian culture. But the artifacts are just the beginning of Etowah's mysteries. The layout of the site itself suggests astronomical knowledge that mainstream archaeology reluctantly acknowledges but struggles to fully explain. The major mounds are arranged in a specific pattern relative to each other and to the surrounding landscape. Mound A, the Great Pyramid, is oriented with its corners pointing roughly to the cardinal directions, not perfectly, but close enough to suggest intentional alignment. From the top of Mound A, sightlines extend to specific points on the horizon that correspond to sunrise and sunset positions at the solstices and equinoxes. Were these ancient architects incorporating astronomical observations into their ceremonial center? If so, what knowledge systems were they drawing upon? And perhaps more importantly, why? Here's where we need to talk about something that most archaeological site markers and museum displays conveniently omit: the giant skeletons. Yes, you heard that right. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, newspaper accounts and archaeological reports from Georgia, including sites in the Etowah area, repeatedly described the excavation of human remains of unusual size. An 1886 report from the New York Times described skeletons of great size discovered in Georgia mounds. An 1894 article from the Macon Telegraph details the discovery of skeletons of gigantic stature in burial mounds in Georgia. These aren't isolated accounts. They're part of a pattern of reports spanning decades and involving multiple independent witnesses, including trained scientists of the era. Now, before you dismiss this as 19th century sensationalism or misidentification of mastodons' bones, consider this. Many of these reports include specific measurements, anatomical descriptions, and details of associated artifacts that suggest the discoverers knew exactly what they were looking at. So what happened to these giant skeletons? That's one of the most troubling aspects of this mystery. Despite numerous documented discoveries, Almost none of these remains exist in museum collections today. The standard explanation is that they were lost, or that the measurements were exaggerated, or that bone diseases like acromegaly or gigantism created individuals of unusual stature. But the sheer number of reports, combined with the systematic absence of physical evidence, has led some researchers to suggest something more troubling: that evidence contradicting the accepted narrative of North American prehistory has been deliberately suppressed. The Smithsonian Institution has been repeatedly accused of collecting such remains and then making them disappear into storage vaults where researchers can't access them. While the Smithsonian categorically denies these accusations, the pattern of documented discoveries followed by systematic absence of evidence is hard to ignore. Let's be clear about what we can prove and what remains speculation. We can prove that Etowah Mounds exists, that it represents a massive investment of labor and engineering skill, and that the artifacts discovered there demonstrate long-distance trade networks and sophisticated craftsmanship. We can prove that the site shows evidence of astronomical alignment, and that it served as a major ceremonial and political center for centuries. What we can't prove, but also can't definitively disprove, is that the builders of Etowah had contact with cultures from outside North America, that they possess technological knowledge beyond what we attribute to them, or that the site's origins may be older than conventional dating suggests. And we certainly can't explain away the persistent reports of anomalous human remains. Walking through Etowah today, standing atop Mound A and looking out over the Etowah River Valley, you can feel the weight of these unanswered questions. This wasn't just a village. This was a capital, a center of power and knowledge, built by people whose full story we've only begun to understand. We still don't know the complete truth about who built Etowah, what knowledge systems they possessed, or why so much evidence seems to have vanished into historical obscurity. Now let's travel south to Macon, Georgia, where another archaeological enigma rises from the banks of the Ocmulgee River, a site that challenges our understanding of pre-Columbian engineering and suggests knowledge transfer that shouldn't have been possible according to conventional timelines. Ocmulgee National Monument preserves one of the most complex archaeological sites in the southeast, featuring massive earthen mounds, a reconstructed earth lodge with astronomical alignments, and evidence of continuous human occupation spanning over 10,000 years. But it's not just the longevity of occupation that makes Ocmulgee extraordinary. It's the specific features that appear to reflect knowledge and design principles that have uncomfortable parallels with structures thousands of miles away in Mesoamerica. The Great Temple Mound at Ocmulgee rises 45 feet above the surrounding terrain, its flat top measuring approximately 300 feet by 270 feet, large enough to hold several modern houses. Like Etowah, this wasn't built all at once but rather in stages over many years, with each phase representing a construction project that would have required coordinating hundreds of workers. But here's what makes Ocmulgee particularly intriguing: the mound's profile, when you look at it from certain angles, bears a striking resemblance to Mesoamerican pyramids, with its steep sides and flat ceremonial platform on top. Now, mainstream archaeologists will tell you this is convergent evolution, that similar functions naturally produce similar forms across cultures. But when you start adding up the similarities between Mississippian ceremonial centers and Mesoamerican sites, the resemblances become harder to dismiss as mere coincidence. Consider the layout. Ocmulgee features a plaza arrangement with mounds positioned around central open spaces used for ceremonies and public gatherings, an organizational principle virtually identical to the layout of Mesoamerican cities like Teotihuacan or Monte Alban. Consider the astronomical alignments. The reconstructed Earth Lodge at Ocmulgee, a circular ceremonial structure with a diameter of 42 feet, features an entrance that aligns precisely with the sunrise at the winter solstice. Inside, the seating arrangement includes a central fire pit and an eagle-shaped platform on the western side, with specific positions that appear designed to catch light at astronomically significant moments. This level of astronomical integration into ceremonial architecture is something we typically associate with Mesoamerican civilizations, not with Mississippian culture. Consider the symbolism. Pottery and artifacts from Ocmulgee feature recurring motifs: serpents, birds, sun symbols, and geometric patterns that have direct parallels in Mesoamerican iconography. The famous Southeastern ceremonial complex, sometimes called the Southern cult, includes imagery of winged serpents, cross and circle designs, and other symbols that appear remarkably similar to Mesoamerican religious iconography. So how do we explain these parallels? The mainstream explanation invokes independent development. Cultures facing similar challenges develop similar solutions, and religious symbolism often converges on similar themes across cultures. But an increasing number of researchers are willing to consider the possibility of actual contact between Mesoamerican civilizations and Mississippian cultures of the Southeast. Trade networks definitely existed. We know that copper, obsidian, and other materials moved across vast distances in prehistoric America. But did ideas also travel these routes? Did Mesoamerican traders or migrants carry architectural principles, astronomical knowledge, and religious concepts northward? And if so, when did this contact occur, and how sustained was it? Here's where the chronology gets interesting and problematic. Ocmulgee's most intensive occupation and major construction phase dates to approximately 900 to 1150 CE, the Mississippian period. This overlaps with the height of several Mesoamerican civilizations, including the Toltec culture and the later phases of classic Maya civilization. The timeline makes contact not only possible but perhaps likely. We know that Mesoamerican traders ranged far and wide in search of valuable commodities like turquoise, which they obtained from sources as distant as the American Southwest. Is it really so implausible that they might have also reached the Southeast, following river networks to trade for copper, mica, and other valuable materials? And if they did make contact, wouldn't they have brought with them the architectural styles, astronomical knowledge, and religious concepts of their home cultures? But let's talk about something even more controversial: the evidence of writing. In the 1960s and 1970s, several researchers claimed to have identified inscriptions at various Georgia sites, including in the Ocmulgee region, that appeared to be written in ancient scripts from the Old World. One particularly controversial example is the so-called Hearn tablet, a stone artifact discovered near Macon that some researchers insist bears markings consistent with ancient Phoenician or Libyan scripts. Mainstream archaeologists dismiss these claims as misidentifications of natural markings or wishful thinking by amateur researchers. But the controversy highlights a larger question: if there's no possibility of Old World contact with pre-Columbian America, why do we keep finding artifacts that suggest otherwise? The Bat Creek stone, discovered in a Tennessee burial mound, bears an inscription that some researchers identify as Paleo-Hebrew. The Grave Creek stone from West Virginia features markings that various researchers have interpreted as everything from Etruscan to ancient Celtic. And while most of these claims have been officially debunked, the pattern of discoveries is intriguing. Let me be clear, I'm not saying definitively that Old World peoples reached the American Southeast before Columbus. What I am saying is that the evidence is more ambiguous than mainstream archaeology would have you believe. Carbon dating places the major construction at Ocmulgee firmly in the Mississippian period, and DNA evidence from burials confirms Native American ancestry. But DNA evidence only tells us who was buried there, not who they may have met or learned from. And carbon dating tells us when organic materials died, not when specific knowledge systems were introduced. The possibility of cultural contact, whether from Mesoamerica or, more controversially, from across the Atlantic, remains open for those willing to look at the evidence without ideological blinders. There's another mystery at Ocmulgee that deserves attention: the sheer scale of earth moving and the efficiency with which it was accomplished. Modern engineers have calculated that moving and shaping the roughly 2 million cubic feet of earth that comprise the Great Temple Mound would require an enormous workforce laboring for years. But here's the puzzle: where did all these workers come from? Where did they live? How were they fed? Archaeological surveys of the surrounding area haven't revealed residential sites sufficient to house a population large enough to construct these massive monuments. Yes, we find evidence of villages and smaller settlements, but nothing that suggests the kind of dense urban population that would be needed to provide construction labor on this scale. This has led some researchers to propose that the mounds were built by a mobilized labor force that came from a wider region, essentially a corvée labor system where subsidiary communities were obligated to provide workers for major construction projects. But even if we accept this model, it implies a level of political organization, resource management, and social control that seems sophisticated beyond what we typically attribute to Mississippian chiefdoms. And then there's the mystery of abandonment. Ocmulgee was largely abandoned by the mid-12th century, and we don't really know why. Climate change is one theory. An extended drought may have made the region less suitable for agriculture. Warfare and social upheaval is another possibility. Perhaps rival chiefdoms fought for control and the site was destroyed or became untenable. But some researchers point to patterns of abandonment across multiple Mississippian sites during roughly the same period and wonder whether something more catastrophic occurred: disease, environmental disaster, or social collapse on a regional scale. Indigenous oral traditions speak of great calamities, of peoples forced to migrate, of ancient cities abandoned to the forest. But these traditions have been largely dismissed by mainstream archaeology as mythological rather than historical. Stand in the restored Earth Lodge at Ocmulgee at dawn on the winter solstice, and you'll witness something extraordinary: sunlight streaming through the entrance, illuminating the eagle platform and casting the interior in golden light. This isn't accident. This is engineered with purpose, demonstrating astronomical knowledge and a deep connection to celestial cycles. These were people who understood the movements of the sun and stars, who built their sacred spaces in alignment with cosmic patterns. They weren't primitive. They were sophisticated observers of the natural world, capable of translating their observations into enduring monuments. Yet despite all we've learned from Ocmulgee, despite decades of excavation, analysis, and study, the site still guards its deepest secrets. We still don't know the full extent of its builders' knowledge, the true nature of their connections to distant cultures, or why they chose to abandon this magnificent ceremonial center to the forest. Let's journey now to the northern reaches of Georgia, to a site that shouldn't exist at all if we believe the conventional narrative, a complex stone structure hidden in the Appalachian foothills that has been carbon dated, measured, and studied, yet remains profoundly unexplained. Fort Mountain, located in Murray County, Georgia, features an ancient stone wall that runs for roughly 855 feet along the mountain's ridge, built from stones that in some places weigh several tons each. The wall varies in height from about 2 feet to 7 feet, and while much of it has collapsed over the centuries, enough remains to give you a sense of the original structure's impressive scale. What makes Fort Mountain so controversial isn't just the wall itself, but the fact that stone architecture of this type simply isn't part of the Mississippian cultural toolkit. These people built with earth and wood, not stone. So who built the Fort Mountain wall, when, and for what purpose? The Cherokee, who occupied this region when European settlers arrived, had their own explanation. They attributed the wall to an ancient race of white people, called the Moonite people, who supposedly inhabited the mountains before being driven out by Cherokee ancestors. According to Cherokee tradition, the Moon-eyed people were nocturnal, with large pale eyes that couldn't tolerate sunlight, hence their name. They lived in stone structures in the mountains and possessed what the Cherokee described as advanced knowledge and unusual customs. When European settlers first heard these legends in the 18th and 19th centuries, some took them as evidence of pre-Columbian European contact with North America. The Welsh, in particular, latched onto the Fort Mountain legends, claiming that the structure was built by followers of Prince Madoc, a Welsh explorer who supposedly reached America in 1170 CE, over 300 years before Columbus. According to this theory, Welsh colonists established settlements in the American interior, intermarried with indigenous peoples, and built stone fortifications like the Fort Mountain Wall before being absorbed into Native American populations. Now, mainstream archaeology treats the Welsh Madoc theory with considerable skepticism, and for good reason. There's no solid archaeological evidence of Welsh settlement in North America, and linguistic studies haven't found convincing Welsh influences in Native American languages. But here's where things get complicated. We can't definitively explain who built the Fort Mountain Wall, or when using conventional models either. Carbon dating of organic materials found near the wall has produced dates ranging from around 400 CE to 500 CE, placing construction during what's called the Woodland period, long before the Mississippian culture emerged. This is problematic because Woodland period peoples of the Southeast didn't typically build monumental stone structures. They built earthworks, yes, but not extensive stone walls on mountain ridges. Let's look at the engineering. The Fort Mountain Wall was constructed using a technique called dry stone masonry, where stones are carefully fitted together without mortar. This requires considerable skill, selecting stones of appropriate size and shape, understanding how to create stable structures through proper weight distribution, and knowing how to create drainage to prevent frost damage. While dry stone masonry is known from various cultures around the world, it's not a technique typically associated with southeastern Native American peoples. The closest parallels in North America come from certain archaeological sites in New England, the so-called Mystery Walls of Connecticut, Vermont, and Massachusetts that some researchers attribute to pre-Columbian European visitors while mainstream archaeologists explain them as colonial-era property boundaries. The resemblance between Fort Mountain's wall and some of these New England structures is striking, but official archaeology maintains that any similarity is coincidental. What was the wall's function? That's another unanswered question. The conventional name, Fort Mountain, implies a defensive structure, and the wall's position along a ridge does suggest a strategic defensive purpose. But the wall has numerous gaps, some ancient, not modern breaches, that would make it ineffective as a fortification. Some researchers have proposed that it was a ceremonial structure rather than a defensive one, perhaps marking sacred space or creating an architectural framework for religious rituals. The wall's alignment has been studied for possible astronomical significance, but results have been inconclusive. Others have suggested it might have been a game court or track for ceremonial athletics, though this seems unlikely given the rough terrain and the wall's irregular course. The truth is, we really don't know what purpose the Fort Mountain Wall served. Now let's talk about the legends and myths associated with the site, because they add layers of mystery that pure archaeology can't address. Beyond the Cherokee stories of the Moon-Eyed people, local folklore includes accounts of tunnels and chambers within Fort Mountain containing hidden treasures or ancient artifacts. In the early 20th century, several amateur excavations were conducted, some by treasure hunters, others by curious locals, and reports circulated of underground passages, carved stones bearing unknown symbols, and artifacts that were quickly spirited away to private collections. As with the giant skeleton reports, we're left with tantalizing stories, but precious little physical evidence. Did these discoveries actually happen? Were they misidentified natural features? Or is there a pattern here of evidence that challenges orthodox history being discovered and then disappearing before it can be properly documented? There's also the matter of other stone structures in the region. Fort Mountain isn't an isolated anomaly. Within a 100-mile radius, researchers have documented dozens of stone structures, walls, cairns, chambers, and other constructions that don't fit neatly into conventional archaeological narratives. Some have been explained as Cherokee or Creek constructions from the historic period, others as works by early European settlers. But a handful of these structures yield dates that place them in the pre-Columbian era, and their construction techniques don't match known patterns of either indigenous or early colonial building. Could there have been a distinct cultural tradition in the southern Appalachians that built primarily in stone, leaving minimal archaeological footprint beyond these puzzling structures? If so, who were these people, and what happened to them? Picture yourself hiking the trail along Fort Mountain's ridge on a misty autumn morning. The forest closes in around you, oak and hickory trees heavy with age. Then suddenly the trees open up and there it is, the ancient wall, gray stones covered in lichens, stretching along the ridge like the spine of some sleeping giant. You run your hand along the weathered surface and feel the craftsmanship, the intentional fitting of stone to stone. Someone built this. Someone organized the labor, hauled these stones up the mountain, and carefully constructed this massive structure for a purpose we can only guess at. The Cherokee said it was the Moon-Eyed people. The Welsh enthusiasts say it was Prince Madoc's followers. Mainstream archaeologists shrug and mumble about woodland period ceremonial structures. But standing there in the morning fog, touching those ancient stones, you realize that all of our theories are just stories we tell ourselves to fill the void of not knowing. The wall keeps its secrets, and we're left to wonder. We still don't know who built Fort Mountain's wall, whether they were indigenous peoples using unusual techniques, pre-Columbian visitors from across the ocean, or some other group entirely lost to history. Travel now to the coastal region of Georgia, where maritime mysteries intersect with archaeological puzzles in ways that challenge our understanding of pre-Columbian navigation and contact. Along Georgia's coast and the barrier islands that protect it, archaeologists have discovered evidence of ancient peoples who were far more sophisticated in their maritime technology than conventional narratives suggest. But beyond the archaeological evidence lies something more controversial: persistent claims of inscribed stones, ancient anchors, and other artifacts that hint at transoceanic contact centuries before Columbus. The epicenter of these coastal mysteries is the region around St. Simon's Island and Jekyll Island, where shell middens, massive deposits of discarded oyster shells accumulated over centuries, reach heights of over 20 feet and contain stratified layers that tell stories of thousands of years of human occupation. The official story goes like this: Georgia's coast was occupied by indigenous peoples for at least 4,000 years, with cultures adapting to the rich maritime environment by developing sophisticated fishing and shellfish harvesting techniques. By the time of European contact, the people living along Georgia's coast were the Gwale and Makama peoples, skilled navigators who used dugout canoes to travel between barrier islands and up the coastal rivers. They built impressive shell-ring structures, circular embankments made entirely from discarded shells, that may have served as foundations for houses or as ceremonial gathering places. The largest of these shell rings measures over 200 feet in diameter, representing an immense accumulation of material over many generations. All of this is well documented, carbon dated, and fits comfortably within conventional archaeological frameworks. But here's where the story gets interesting. In 1963, a physician and amateur archaeologist named Dr. Joseph Mahan documented what he claimed was an inscribed stone recovered from a burial mound near Brunswick, Georgia. The stone, according to Mahan, bore characters that resembled ancient alphabetic scripts from the Mediterranean region. Mainstream archaeologists dismissed the find as either a hoax or a misidentification of natural markings. But Mahan wasn't alone in such claims. Throughout the 20th century, various researchers reported finding inscribed stones, unusual artifacts, and other evidence suggesting pre-Columbian contact along Georgia's coast. These claims have been systematically rejected by mainstream archaeology, often without serious investigation. The pattern is familiar: any evidence suggesting Old World contact before Columbus is dismissed a priori, regardless of the credentials of the discoverer or the nature of the evidence. Let's examine one particularly intriguing example: the alleged discovery of ancient Mediterranean-style anchors off Georgia's coast. In the 1970s, divers reported finding stone anchors with distinctive design features consistent with Phoenician or Roman anchors, resting on the seabed near Georgia's barrier islands. Now, skeptics immediately point out that stone anchors were used by various cultures, that design similarities don't prove origin, and that such objects could have arrived via historical shipwrecks from the colonial period or later. All valid points. But here's the problem: the divers who made these reports were experienced, and they documented the anchors' positions and characteristics. The stones were covered in marine growth suggesting considerable age, and their designs didn't match anchors from the colonial period. So where are these anchors now? As with so many pieces of controversial evidence, they seem to have vanished, either lost to private collections or dismissed and not preserved by official institutions. The possibility of pre-Columbian transoceanic contact with Georgia's coast isn't as far-fetched as it might sound. We know that ancient Mediterranean cultures were capable of extended ocean voyages. Phoenician sailors circumnavigated Africa around 600 BC. Roman ships regularly sailed to India and back. Viking longships reached North America by 1000 CE, establishing settlements in Newfoundland. This is now indisputable fact, proven by archaeology. So why is it so hard to accept that other ancient mariners might have also crossed the Atlantic, either intentionally or by accident? Ocean currents and prevailing winds could carry a disabled ship from the Mediterranean or West Africa directly to the Caribbean and the southeastern coast of North America. The Canary Current flows into the North Equatorial Current, which runs straight across the Atlantic to the Americas. A ship caught in this current system would inevitably end up in the New World, whether its crew wanted to or not. Now consider this. Indigenous peoples along Georgia's coast had traditions of bearded strangers arriving by sea in ancient times. Multiple Native American oral histories from the Southeast reference mysterious visitors, often described as different in appearance from indigenous peoples, who came by boat and shared knowledge of agriculture, astronomy, or other skills before departing or being absorbed into native populations. Could these legends be cultural memories of actual contact events? Mainstream anthropologists generally interpret such legends as mythological or as later inventions influenced by European contact. But what if these stories preserve genuine historical memories, passed down through generations? The Cherokee story of the Moon-Eyed People is one example. Creek and other southeastern peoples have similar traditions of ancient peoples who preceded them or visited them in the distant past. Let's look at biological evidence. Studies of pre-Columbian plant and animal distributions have revealed some puzzling patterns. Sweet potatoes, a crop domesticated in South America, were being cultivated in Polynesia before European contact, clear evidence of trans-Pacific contact or transport, though the mechanism remains debated. Cotton species found in pre-Columbian America include genetic material from Old World cotton species, suggesting at minimum the transfer of seeds across the ocean. Coconuts, traditionally thought to have been introduced to the Americas by Spanish colonizers, have been found in pre-Columbian contexts in Panama and Ecuador. Each of these examples has been debated and contested, but collectively they suggest that the oceans may not have been the impermeable barriers we once imagined. If plants could cross the Atlantic or Pacific before Columbus, why not people? Along Georgia's coast, archaeologists have documented sophisticated maritime technology among pre-Columbian peoples. Large dugout canoes capable of carrying 20 or more people have been recovered from coastal sites. Some of these canoes show evidence of advanced construction techniques, including the use of fire and stone tools to carefully hollow out massive cypress logs. But some researchers point to evidence of even more advanced watercraft. Shell middens and archaeological sites have yielded what appear to be rigging stones, ballast materials, and other artifacts that could be associated with sailed vessels rather than just paddle-powered canoes. Could indigenous peoples of Georgia's coast have developed sailing technology independently? Or did they learn it from visitors who arrived from across the ocean? Imagine standing on a barrier island off Georgia's coast at dawn, watching the sun rise over the Atlantic. The beach stretches empty in both directions, live oaks draped in Spanish moss forming a maritime forest behind you. The rhythmic crash of waves has eroded the beach, exposing a dark layer in the sand, a buried shell midden, its contents tumbling onto the beach. You pick through the debris, oyster shells, pottery fragments, the bones of fish and turtles. And there, nestled among the ancient refuse, something unusual, a stone carved with deliberate marks, its surface smoothed by human hands. You hold it, this mystery object from the distant past, and wonder about the hands that shaped it. Was it carved by the ancestors of the Guayal peoples, its markings simply decorative? Or does it bear a message from visitors who came and went centuries before history was written? The ocean keeps its secrets well. Ships sink, evidence erodes, and time washes away the traces of those who came before. We still don't know who all visited Georgia's shores in the millennia before European colonization, or what knowledge and technologies might have been exchanged during those forgotten encounters. Now we turn to one of Georgia's most controversial and suppressed archaeological mysteries, a site that was discovered, partially excavated, then deliberately buried both physically and figuratively by authorities who seemed determined to erase it from the historical record. In the 1830s, during the forced removal of Cherokee peoples from Georgia along the Trail of Tears, reports emerged of ancient ruins discovered in the mountains of North Georgia that bore no resemblance to known Cherokee constructions. These ruins included stone walls built with precision masonry, fortification features, and what some reports describe as the remains of ancient smelting operations for metals. The discoveries were documented in contemporary newspapers and correspondence, but within a few decades, the sites were covered over, either by natural processes or by deliberate concealment, and their very existence began to be questioned. The most detailed accounts come from the Dahlonega area, in the heart of Georgia's gold mining region. Gold was discovered in this area in 1828, triggering the first major gold rush in American history, predating California's more famous rush by 2 decades. As miners dug into the hills searching for gold-bearing ore, they reportedly encountered ancient mine shafts that predated their own excavations. These old mines showed evidence of organized operation, with timber supports, ventilation shafts, and methodical extraction techniques. But here's where it gets controversial. Some accounts describe these ancient mines as containing tools and artifacts that didn't match indigenous technology, specifically, references to iron implements and advanced mining techniques that native peoples supposedly didn't possess. Now, I can hear the skeptics already. 19th century miners were notoriously unreliable observers, prone to exaggeration and eager to generate publicity for their claims. Fair enough. But the reports weren't limited to uneducated prospectors. Trained geologists and mining engineers who surveyed the Dahlonega region in the mid-1800s also documented evidence of ancient mining activity. One particularly detailed report from 1849, published in a mining journal, describes ancient excavations that penetrated deep into gold-bearing veins, with evidence of sophisticated knowledge of ore geology and extraction techniques. The author estimated that thousands of pounds of gold had been removed in prehistory, raising the obvious question, who mined it, and where did it go? The Cherokee themselves had traditions of gold in the mountains, but claimed they didn't mine it extensively. Cherokee elders told early settlers that the gold deposits were known to ancient peoples who preceded them in the region, again, a reference to pre-Cherokee inhabitants of the mountains. Spanish explorers in the 16th century heard Native American accounts of mountains rich in gold in the interior of the southeast. The infamous Hernando de Soto expedition, which marched through Georgia and the broader southeast from 1539 to 1543, was partially motivated by these reports of gold. De Soto encountered various indigenous chiefdoms, some of which possessed copper ornaments and pearls but apparently little gold. This has led some researchers to speculate that if gold was being extracted from Georgia's mountains in prehistory, it was being traded away to distant regions, perhaps to Mesoamerican civilizations where gold was highly prized for ritual and ornamental purposes. Let's examine the metallurgical question more closely, because it cuts to the heart of what we think we know about pre-Columbian technology in North America. Conventional archaeology holds that indigenous peoples of eastern North America worked copper extensively but didn't smelt iron or other metals requiring high-temperature furnaces. Copper was cold-worked or annealed, heated and hammered, to create tools and ornaments, but the technology of smelting or to extract metal was supposedly absent. Yet archaeologists have discovered iron artifacts in pre-Columbian contexts at various North American sites. Most of these are explained as meteoric iron, metal from fallen meteorites that was worked without smelting. But a few examples have raised questions. In the 1930s, excavations at a site in Michigan recovered iron artifacts that some researchers claimed showed evidence of smelting rather than meteoric origin, though this interpretation has been disputed. In Georgia, the reports of ancient mining operations sometimes include references to slag heaps, the waste product of ore smelting, and to stone furnaces or hearths that could have been used for high-temperature metalworking. If these reports are accurate, they suggest a level of metallurgical sophistication that doesn't fit conventional models. But here's the problem: almost none of the physical evidence survived or was preserved. The Gold Rush era was a time of tremendous disruption. Entire hillsides were hydraulically mined away, ancient features were destroyed in the search for ore, and anything that might have served as archaeological evidence was lost. By the time professional archaeologists began systematic surveys of the region in the 20th century, the landscape had been so altered that tracing ancient features became nearly impossible. There's another aspect to the North Georgia mystery that deserves mention: the persistent reports of ancient fortifications built with stone that showed knowledge of defensive architecture. Several sites in the mountainous counties reported walls, moats, and other features that early settlers interpreted as fortifications. Some of these were undoubtedly Cherokee constructions from the historic period, but others were attributed by Cherokee informants to earlier peoples. The most detailed descriptions mention walls built with fitted stone, creating defensible positions on hilltops and ridges, features that parallel stone fortifications from other parts of the world but that don't fit the expected pattern of Mississippian or woodland period architecture in the southeast. One particularly intriguing site was documented in Murray County, the same county where Fort Mountain is located, in the 1840s. A local settler described what he interpreted as the ruins of an ancient fortified town, with stone walls enclosing several acres and the remains of structures within. He reported finding pottery, stone tools, and what he described as swords of copper among the ruins. This account appeared in a regional newspaper and was repeated in several local histories of the period, but by the late 1800s, the site could no longer be located. The land had been cleared for agriculture, and any surface features had been incorporated into field walls or covered over. No archaeological investigation was ever conducted, and the site remains lost, if it ever existed beyond the imagination of a settler eager to add glamour to his property claims. But let's assume for a moment that at least some of these reports had a basis in reality. What would it mean? It would suggest that the ancient Southeast was home to peoples or visitors with knowledge systems and technologies that we haven't fully accounted for. It would imply that our neat categorical boundaries, indigenous peoples here, European colonizers there, Old World technologies versus New World technologies, are too simplistic to capture the complexity of what actually happened over millennia of human occupation. It would mean that evidence has been lost, through accident, through negligence, or perhaps through deliberate suppression by institutions more interested in preserving orthodox narratives than in pursuing inconvenient truths. Stand in the hills around Dahlonega today and you're surrounded by beauty, the southern Appalachians rolling away in every direction, forests reclaiming land that was once mined bare. Somewhere beneath your feet might lie the remnants of ancient mines, worked by hands unknown, yielding gold that was fashioned into ornaments now lost or melted down centuries ago. The earth keeps its secrets, and the passage of time buries evidence deeper with each passing year. We still don't know the full story of who extracted gold from these mountains, whether they possessed advanced metallurgical knowledge that challenges our assumptions about pre-Columbian technology, or why the evidence of their work has proven so elusive. Let us turn now to one of Georgia's most enigmatic sites, a place where astronomy, geometry, and mystery intersect in ways that have fascinated and frustrated researchers for generations. In Elberton, Georgia, there stands a modern monument that has attracted considerable attention, the Georgia Guidestones, a granite structure erected in 1980 with inscriptions in multiple languages. But our focus isn't on this relatively recent construction. Instead, we need to talk about what archaeologists have found in the broader Elberton area, evidence of ancient astronomical observation sites that suggest sophisticated knowledge of celestial mechanics among peoples we're told were primitive. The Elberton region sits on the edge of Georgia's Piedmont, an area rich in granite outcroppings and characterized by rolling hills that provide excellent vantage points for observing the horizon. Several sites in this region have been identified as possible ancient observatories. These aren't massive stone circles like Stonehenge but rather more subtle arrangements, standing stones, stone cairns, and rock outcroppings that have been modified or marked in ways that align with significant astronomical events. The problem is that these sites have received almost no official archaeological attention. Most have been documented by amateur researchers whose findings are dismissed by mainstream archaeology as wishful thinking. But when you examine the evidence, when you actually visit these sites at the solstices or equinoxes and observe the alignments, it's hard to dismiss them entirely. One example, a site in Elbert County features a large granite boulder with a naturally occurring but perfectly circular opening near its base. The opening is approximately 18 inches in diameter, and it frames specific points on the horizon when viewed from certain positions. Researchers who have studied the site claim that at sunrise on the winter solstice, the sun appears directly centered in this opening when viewed from a specific standing stone located 30 feet away. The probability of this being accidental, a natural opening randomly aligning with both a standing stone and a significant solar event, is quite low. But because the site isn't officially recognized, it isn't protected, and development in the area threatens to destroy it. Why the lack of official recognition? Part of the problem is that astronomical alignments are difficult to prove definitively unless you have associated artifacts that can be carbon dated or unless the alignment is so precise that coincidence can be ruled out. A structure like Stonehenge, with dozens of stones aligned to multiple astronomical events with great precision, is undeniable. A single standing stone that might align with a solstice sunrise is easier to dismiss. But when you start finding multiple such features across a region, the cumulative evidence becomes more compelling. The Elberton area has at least a dozen documented sites with possible astronomical alignments, most of which have never been professionally excavated or studied. Let's talk about what astronomical knowledge implies. To create even a simple solar calendar, you need to make careful observations over at least a year, marking the points where the sun rises and sets on the horizon throughout the annual cycle. To identify the solstices, the longest and shortest days of the year, you need to track these observations over multiple years to identify the patterns. To predict eclipses, you need to understand the moon's cycle and the tilt of Earth's axis relative to the sun and moon. This is sophisticated observational astronomy, requiring dedication, record-keeping, and mathematical thinking. Mainstream archaeology acknowledges that Mississippian peoples had astronomical knowledge. The alignments at Ocmulgee and Etowah prove that. But the astronomical sites in the Elberton area may predate the Mississippian period, potentially going back to woodland or even archaic times. If that's the case, it pushes back the timeline for advanced astronomical observation in the Southeast considerably. There's a broader question here about pre-Columbian science and mathematics. For decades, the dominant narrative portrayed indigenous peoples of North America as technologically and intellectually inferior to European civilizations, a narrative that served to justify colonization and cultural genocide. Modern archaeology has worked to correct this grossly prejudiced view, demonstrating the sophistication of Native American societies. But in correcting one extreme, have we perhaps created new orthodoxies that make it difficult to acknowledge the full range of pre-Columbian achievements? If evidence suggests that ancient peoples of Georgia had advanced astronomical knowledge, why isn't that celebrated and studied? If stone structures in the southeast show geometric precision and intentional alignment, why aren't they protected and researched? Part of the answer lies in funding and priorities. Archaeological research requires money, and there's only so much to go around. Major sites like Etowah and Ocmulgee receive federal protection and research support because they fit clearly into established frameworks. More ambiguous sites, places that might challenge conventional narratives or that require specialized study to interpret, often fall through the cracks. Another part of the answer is institutional conservatism. Academia, for all its supposed openness to new ideas, can be remarkably resistant to evidence that challenges established paradigms. Researchers who pursue controversial topics risk their careers, as funding agencies and tenure committees look askance at work that strays too far from accepted frameworks. But let's bring this back to the specific mystery of Elberton's astronomical sites. If we accept that they are intentional constructions designed for astronomical observation, what does that tell us about the people who built them? It tells us they valued knowledge of celestial cycles, presumably for agricultural timing, religious purposes, or both. It tells us they had the social organization to undertake construction projects and maintain observational traditions over generations. It tells us they thought in terms of long-time scales, planning monuments that would function for centuries. These aren't the characteristics of primitive peoples struggling to survive. These are the characteristics of sophisticated cultures with the leisure time and social complexity to pursue knowledge for its own sake. Now imagine standing at one of these sites, perhaps at dawn on the winter solstice. The granite outcropping is cold beneath your hands, and mist rises from the valleys below. The sky lightens in the east, and you position yourself exactly where the ancient observers would have stood, watching the horizon. And then it happens. The sun's first rays strike the horizon at precisely the point marked by the stone, the light streaming through the opening or casting a shadow that marks the turning of the year. In that moment, you're connected across millennia to the people who first stood here, who first noticed this alignment and marked it for future generations. You realize that the desire to understand the cosmos, to mark time, to create meaning through observation of the heavens, these are human universals that transcend culture and era. We still don't know who first marked these stones, how far back the tradition of astronomical observation extends in this region, or what became of the knowledge systems that produced these monuments. As we draw together the threads of these mysteries, we need to step back and ask the larger question: what do Georgia's lost megastructures tell us about pre-Columbian America, about the capabilities of indigenous peoples, and about the gaps in our understanding of the past? The evidence we've examined, from Etowah's massive mounds to Fort Mountain's enigmatic wall, from Ocmulgee's astronomical alignments to the coastal mysteries suggesting transoceanic contact, from the suppressed reports of ancient mines to the astronomical sites of Elberton, collectively paints a picture that's far more complex and intriguing than the sanitized version presented in most textbooks. We're talking about cultures that built monuments rivaling the pyramids in scale, that traded across thousands of miles, that possessed sophisticated astronomical knowledge, and that left behind tantalizing hints of contact with distant peoples. But we're also talking about massive gaps in the evidence, gaps created by the passage of time, by the destruction wrought during colonization, and perhaps by deliberate suppression of inconvenient findings. Those giant skeletons systematically reported in the 19th century, and then systematically absent from museum collections. Those inscribed stones that suggest pre-Columbian writing or Old World contact. Those reports of advanced mining operations and metallurgical sophistication. Where did all this evidence go? Was it misidentified, as skeptics claim? Was it hoaxed by attention-seeking amateurs? Or was there a pattern of institutional gatekeeping, where evidence that challenged the accepted narrative of American prehistory was quietly shelved or made to disappear? Let me be clear about what I'm arguing, and what I'm not. I'm not claiming that ancient aliens built Georgia's mounds or that Atlantis refugees settled in the Appalachians. But I am suggesting that the people who lived in this region for millennia before European contact were capable of achievements that mainstream archaeology has been slow to recognize. I'm suggesting that cultural contact, whether from Mesoamerica or across the Atlantic, is more plausible than conventional models allow. And I'm suggesting that the historical record has been sanitized, with evidence that doesn't fit neatly into accepted frameworks being dismissed rather than investigated. Consider the implications if even a fraction of the controversial evidence turns out to be legitimate. If Mesoamerican traders or migrants did reach the Southeast in pre-Columbian times, it would mean that American history isn't a story of isolated continents developing in complete independence before Columbus bridged the gap. It would mean cultural exchange and the spread of ideas occurred across a much wider geographic area than we've imagined. If Old World mariners did reach American shores before the Vikings, whether by design or by accident, it would mean our understanding of ancient navigation and exploration needs to be radically revised. If indigenous peoples possessed metallurgical and astronomical knowledge beyond what we've credited them with, it would require acknowledging that technological development in the Americas was far more sophisticated than Eurocentric narratives have admitted. But beyond these specific questions lies a more fundamental issue: our relationship with the past and with mystery itself. We live in an age that demands answers, that wants everything explained and categorized. Ambiguity makes us uncomfortable. So when we encounter evidence that doesn't fit, that suggests our neat historical narratives are incomplete, there's a temptation to dismiss it rather than sit with the discomfort of not knowing. Scientists sometimes fall into this trap, too. The scientific method is powerful, but it can become dogmatic when practitioners confuse the current state of knowledge with absolute truth. The fact that we can't explain something with our current models doesn't mean it didn't happen. It might just mean our models are incomplete. Georgia's archaeological mysteries invite us to embrace that uncertainty, to acknowledge that the past is far stranger and more complex than we've imagined. They remind us that our ancestors, all of them, from all cultures, were clever, resourceful, and capable of remarkable achievements. They challenge us to look past the distortions introduced by colonialism, by academic gatekeeping, and by our own preconceptions. And they whisper to us across the centuries, these silent monuments of earth and stone, asking us to remember that knowledge is always provisional, that history is always being rewritten, and that the most important discoveries are often the ones that shake our certainties to their foundations. Stand once more atop Etowah's great mound, or walk the ridge at Fort Mountain, or watch the winter sun rise through a stone opening in Elberton. Feel the weight of those ancient hands that shaped these places, the countless generations who lived and died without leaving written records but who left monuments that endure. Their stories are written in earth and stone, in the alignments of their observatories and the artifacts scattered through the soil. We're only beginning to learn to read these texts, and with each reading, the story grows richer and stranger. The mainstream narrative of American prehistory has been too narrow for too long, constrained by theoretical frameworks that leave little room for the unexpected, the anomalous, the truly mysterious. But the evidence is there for those willing to look without prejudice, to question without cynicism, and to wonder without demanding immediate answers. What drove ancient peoples to move millions of cubic feet of earth, creating monuments that would last millennia? What knowledge systems allowed them to align their structures with celestial precision? What stories did they tell about visitors from distant lands, and how much truth lies within those legends? We may never know for certain. Some secrets are kept by time itself, buried beneath layers of soil and centuries of forgetting. But in not knowing, in sitting with these mysteries and pondering them, we honor the complexity of the past and the ingenuity of all peoples. We open ourselves to the possibility that history is far richer than we've been taught, that the story of human achievement isn't a simple progression from primitive to civilized, from ignorance to enlightenment, but rather a complex tapestry woven from many threads across many lands. So keep digging, keep questioning, keep wondering. Visit these sites if you can, touch the ancient stones, stand where ancient astronomers stood, and let yourself feel the mystery. Don't let anyone tell you the story is settled or that all the questions have been answered. Read the academic papers, yes, but also read the old newspaper accounts, the suppressed reports, the controversial theories. Use your judgment, weigh the evidence, and come to your own conclusions. The past belongs to all of us, not just to academic gatekeepers. And the greatest mysteries, the ones that really matter, are often those that resist easy answers, that require us to expand our thinking and challenge our assumptions. Georgia's lost megastructures stand as testament to human ambition, ingenuity, and the eternal desire to create something that outlasts our brief time on Earth. They've guarded their secrets for centuries, and they'll likely guard them for centuries more. But with each new discovery, with each careful excavation and thoughtful analysis, we draw a little closer to understanding. And in the meantime, we can marvel at what they represent, the enduring mystery of the past, forever calling us to look deeper, think harder, and never stop seeking the truth. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet, waiting for those brave enough to uncover them.